welcome to Office Hours. This is a program where we invite luminaries from the software world to share insights. These are one-on-one sessions with experts, and they've been a huge success. I'm Lauren Demuse, partner and COO at Theory, and I'm delighted to introduce our discussion today. We'll chat in the fireside format for about 40 minutes, and please feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and I can see if we can intersperse them along the way. With that, let me get started with some introductions. Tom is a general partner at Theory Ventures, our $230 million fund focused on companies leveraging technical discontinuities into go-to-market advantages. Prior to founding Theory, Tom spent 14 years at Redpoint as a general partner where he made investments such as Arbitrum and Miston. We're joined by Stephen Goldfeder, co-founder and CEO of Offchain Labs. Stephen has been a preeminent voice on blockchain over the past decade, since completing his computer science PhD with a focus on cryptography at Princeton in 2013, and authoring many seminal papers behind modern blockchains with the mission to demystify its technology and empower others to harness its potential. His comprehensive introduction to cryptocurrencies has been cited nearly 3,000 times. He's also co-authored a paper called Flashbots about front-running and decentralized exchanges that we believe at some point should be made into a Michael Lewis book. Before founding Offchain with Princeton colleagues, Stephen had stints in Cornell, Google, and Microsoft Research. And beyond his technical innovations, Stephen has also deployed a powerful developer relations strategy, recognizing the importance of community engagement and support for widespread adoption. Today, we'll have the chance to probe these experiences more deeply. And with that, I'll hand it over to Tom.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Stephen, thanks, and welcome to the show. We really appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've had the privilege of working with you for a couple of years now, and one of the things that I appreciate the most about you is there are a lot of really sophisticated concepts in crypto that you understand from the very depth, but your ability to describe them in really clear terms is unique. And so just to kick off the show and share with everybody, I think it's very easy to forget how successful a company and a project like Arbitrum can be. Just to level set, market cap of the token is about $20 million as of today. The project has 1 million followers on Twitter. In terms of relative market share, Arbitrum is 40 to 55% of all the TVL across the two chains, worth about 13 billion. And then the stat that I saw on Twitter recently that blew my mind was 75% of all native Ethereum that leaves a centralized exchange goes onto an Arbitrum chain. That's just staggering. So congratulations, Stephen. I think a big driver here, and one of the things that I think really separates what you've built is your approach to the developer community, right? On top of these chains, we need application developers to build interesting apps, right? Whether they're DeFi applications or their games or NFT applications or any number of other things. You've done it in a really different way. Can you talk a little bit about how you thought through that strategy and what you did that was so different in the market?
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, I think it's important to realize as we're building here that the community, and the community includes the developer community, the community of users that use the tech, are really probably the most important piece of the puzzle. And the technology that we build is very important, extremely important. It's a necessity. But without the users, without the developers, without the community, it's not going to be very interesting. And this is actually probably something which a Web 2 and a Web 3 company, they don't really understand each other often. When I talk to Web 2 founders, they say, wait, the Arbitrum project gave the majority of its control to the community. What does that mean? And why would you do that? That seems crazy. But if you actually look at Web 2 companies, and I was actually talking to Hayden from Uniswap last night, we were talking about YouTube, and you see these, where the success comes from. It often comes from the community and the people, the builders, the creators. It could be different people there. And I think it's very natural then I think it's Web 3 people who are doing it right and actually giving the value to those that are very valuable. It's the Web 2 companies that maybe have some catch up to do and understanding who's important, who creates value, and trying to give those people a voice as well. For us, it was always very important to recognize the importance of that community. Web 3 makes that easy to recognize as strong communities that are very engaged. But also, I think the thing that we did particularly different than others, it goes back about 3 years ago now, although today it's relatively standard. We pioneered this thing called the fair launch. And that can mean different things in different contexts, but in the context of launching a chain, it meant the following. It meant that no one gets priority access to launch their applications on the chain. Nobody gets the red carpet rolled out for them. Everyone is on the same footing. And this seems obvious now, but actually back then it was controversial. Some of our competitors were saying, hey, what are the biggest projects on Ethereum? we're going to roll out the red carpet for them. They're going to get to launch before everyone else, and they're going to have a head start. And our approach was, if this project is winning on Ethereum, they're probably really good at what they're doing. So they're probably going to be dominant in Arbitrum 2, just by the nature of them executing in the way that they've demonstrated they know how to. But it's not our job to put our finger on the scale, put our thumb on the scale here and say, because they're successful in Ethereum, they're going to have a head start and they're going to get special treatment there. And that's something which we did. So how did this play out in practice? We often talk about August of 2021 as the date when Arbitrum was launched, and it was the last day of August of 2021. And this was a day, though, that it was launched to the public. But if you go back a few months, in May of 2021, that's when Arbitrum was launched to developers. And we took a very wide view of developers. We said, if you're developing a project, you can get access to Arbitrum today. If you're a developer in May of 2021, just let us know what your GitHub is, fill out a simple form, you can get access to the chain. And the analogy is, if you're building an amusement park and it's imagine that the rides are contracted out, you'd want the rides to exist before the users exist. And putting everyone on the same footing. And I remember in July of that year, we got some pressure. Hey, we're ready to go open this up. And so no, we want to give everyone equal time and sufficient time to do that. And the same day that an Arbitrum went live, Uniswap went live, SushiSwap went live, and a little exchange that you probably never heard of called Swapper went live. And the idea is that it's not our responsibility, it's not our job, and it's not our role to say, okay, Uniswap, SushiSwap, you guys are going to get special treatment. No, swappers should have the same ability to compete, and it should be up to them to compete and do well. And the last thing I'll say on this point is, it's very easy, and this is why I think it leads to some of the success of Arbitrum. It's very easy to see who the winners of today are. It's much, much harder to see who the winners of tomorrow will be. And especially in crypto, when a lot of the typical barriers are broken down, had we played that strategy, we would have worked with the existing winners. We would have missed so much. GMX is a great example. This is an app that came to Arbitrum in 2021. They had 2 people on the team at the time. They weren't very relevant at the time, but we held their hand and we worked with them just like we did every other app. And we treated them with the same treatment that we gave the big ones and the small ones. We didn't really care. Everyone got the same equal treatment. And they obviously turned out to be one of the largest protocols in DeFi.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it was a very sort of counterculture at the time. And I think a lot of the other chains, they really focused, you have this power law that exists within Web3, where a handful of the protocols or a handful of the projects are really driving a lot of the volume. And so there was this natural impulse or inclination for a lot of people to go after them. And I think you really took a much longer term view that the ecosystem was young. And like you said, it's really difficult to predict where that next lightning bolt will come from. And I think that the communities rallied around that. Some of the more recent developments was looking at treasure data coming onto Arbitrum, and then 8chain most recently on the Orbit product, where the votes are overwhelmingly in favor. The community votes on which chain to use. And in both of those cases, the communities of those projects overwhelmingly voted to come to Arbitrum.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it speaks to the strength of the community generally. And the nice thing about the Arbitrum community is it's not one community, it's many communities. So you have, like you said, the treasure community, you have other communities that intersect, you have the GMX community, and they're all loosely aligned around Arbitrum, but also have their own interests. And that's how things work when there's actually real people that are interested, right? If everyone agrees all the time, they probably don't care, or they're not engaged, or they're not empowered to actually. So I think the combination of an Arbitrum of you have these engaged communities, they have actual control that they're exercising. But there's definitely a ton of Arbitrum support in these communities. And I think it's because, again, it's this fairness and this neutrality, right? The idea is even those who don't necessarily win and don't come out on top understand that they had a fair chance and they had a fair shot. And the cards, it wasn't rigged against them. And I think that's very important for empowering people to try and do their best, as opposed to say, hey, why would I build on this chain? Everything's stacked against me.
Yeah, it goes back to the ethos of Web3, which is, as you said before, breaking down a lot of the existing power dynamics.
Absolutely.
So a lot of these groups have moved to Arbitrum. There's one of the major reasons, in addition to the community, is just the price performance. If you take a look at Arbitrum 1, which was the first product, and then Nova, which is focused more on gaming and social, people are coming to Arbitrum because of a lot of the original research ideas you had at Princeton. I'm curious, can you talk a bit, just for a high level for the audience, just describe the differences between the 3 different chains? Let's start with the first 2. Let's start with Arbitrum 1 and Arbitrum Nova, and then we'll touch on the L3 Arbitrum Orbit.
Yeah, so Arbitrum 1 was the initial chain that launched that chain we talked about in August of 2021. And they're all general purpose chains, which means you can launch they support the full EVM, the Ethereum virtual machine. You can launch whatever you want on them. but for different reasons, they'll often appeal to different users. So Arbitrum One was initially took off in DeFi, and today it is dominant in DeFi. And if you're building something interesting in DeFi, by interesting, unique, and tries new ideas as opposed to just copying some other project, you're probably doing that, launching that on Arbitrum today. And the fees are much, much cheaper than Ethereum, and it does that by some of the core technology, core rollup technology that's able to lower the fees significantly while still deriving security from Ethereum. But we had this realization a few years back that this is like great for a lot of projects. Like for a DeFi project, if you're doing a trade on chain or doing some sort of swap, yeah, a fee that's a couple of cents is probably going to be just fine for most users. Even if you're trading like $5 or $10, a 3-cent fee seems like reasonable. So it's like a really good place to be, as opposed to an Ethereum where the fees could be in the dollars or more. So it seemed like a very good place to be. That being said, for other applications, it seems like those few cent fees were still quite high, in particular when you think about gaming or social applications on chain. A game is supposed to be fun. And if you are paying like 3 cents or 5 cents every time you do something in the game, your wallet's quickly going to get drained. And for most people, that's not going to be a very fun experience. Similar for social applications, in particular for a lot of these like social and even gaming applications, the app developers pay the fees on behalf of users. They want to abstract that away. And then these become very expensive for the development teams. They become unsustainable. So we had this realization of, it wasn't like me saying, hey, Arbitrum rollup, the full rollup technology, which is what runs in Arbitrum One, is the best thing you can do. And I'm going to sit in my ivory tower and say everyone should go there. That's the best thing. That wasn't like what's going to happen. You have to be pragmatic as well. And for some people, that's going to be great and that's going to work. And we saw that in DeFi, certainly, and in some NFT projects, particularly high value NFT projects in Arbitrum, Treasure, their small brains, they were doing just fine there. But we said we were seeing this trend where other gaming projects were saying, like, this might be the best. Like, they're not even arguing that, yeah, sure, this is the best from a security, decentralization, everything's great here, but like, it just doesn't work for them. The economics don't work. Pragmatically, it just doesn't work. And then that's where you have to say, okay, so where are they going? They were going to, at that time, side chains or alternative layer ones, which were like, by all means, much less secure. So the question that we asked ourselves was, is there a way that we can leverage the core Arbitrum technology, but in a way that has a lower price point for these people? The security might not be quite all the way to the rollup, but if it's a lot better than the alternative, it's good. Because again, like, people would ask me, like, why are you creating a product that does not all the way roll up? And the answer is because the people are not, it's not like they're saying, okay, if Steven doesn't create another project that's, we're going to stay here, we're stuck. No, they're going to go to something that's much, much less secure and much worse. And can we keep these users in a high security environment and give them sort of something in between? And that's where Arbitrum Nova and the technology behind Arbitrum Nova is what's called AnyTrust. Arbitrum AnyTrust comes from, and it really, I think, appealed to a lot of game developers, and it's doing fantastically well today as well.
Yeah, and the idea there is, if you're a game developer or a social developer, you're willing to trade slightly less security for significantly lower cost per transaction, because the value per transaction should be a lot lower too.
Exactly, because we want to give you a high security, we have to meet you where it works. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I'd rather you have a choice between Arbitrum Nova, which basically uses the same of the core of the Arbitrum fraud proofs and all that. The difference is, instead of putting all the data on Ethereum, it sends it to a data availability committee. And by the way, now, fast forward 2 years later, there are alternative other data availability projects as well, like Celestia, EigenDA, Espresso, all of which are already or will be compatible with Arbitrum chains. So you can basically choose what you want. And the idea is that to meet you where it works, because again, the people weren't deciding, yeah, I guess if they don't launch something else, I'm going to launch an Arbitrum Nova. They were going to launch an Arbitrum One, and my game will be a little more expensive. No, they were saying, I can't launch in this environment. It's great that it's 95% cheaper than Ethereum, but for my particular use case, I actually need like 900 time. I don't know, like much, much cheaper than that. And then the question is, okay, how do we get that? And then the answer is, and we thought about it, like, do we have something to offer? If the answer was no, the low security options are the only ones, then we wouldn't have gotten into the market. But the answer was no, actually, with the Arbitrum AnyTrust design, we can offer a technology path, a stack that is much more secure than the alternatives they will otherwise choose. And that seemed to be, and by the way, we were very clear in our messaging and my messaging, and now today in the Arbitrum Foundation's messaging, that we believe for DeFi, for financial projects that can afford the cost, Arbitrum One is worth paying the premium, right? So it's not like this chain cannibalized that one. It's cheaper, but Arbitrum One is still doing quite well, because the projects that can afford it, for which it does make sense, appreciate that what they're getting there. But they're two different projects at two different price points, at two different security trade-off points that really meet the needs of different verticals of the space.
So That's a great summary. It seems to me like, so in the core Web 2 world, database market's 100 billion in spend. You have lots of different kinds of databases, time series databases, document databases, analytical database, transactional databases, I can go on, graph databases. And it seems like the same thing is happening within Web 3, where Ethereum was the chain that really proved proof of stake. Arbitrum 1 was a meaningful reduction in, or meaningful improvement in price performance. You have Arbitrum Nova that is now focused on a different set of workloads, gaming and social versus DeFi. And so that's, those two are called L2s. And then you have this concept which is called the L3, which is basically allows a further sort of customization of the underlying programming and database of ETH. And that's where Orbit comes in.
Yeah, and actually Orbit is even more general today. It started off as L3s, but today, as of a few weeks ago, there's something called the Arbitrum Expansion Pack, which is you can build an Orbit chain L2 and you can build an Orbit L3 as well. In fact, you can build an Orbit L3 on Arbitrum 1. You can build an Orbit L3 on Arbitrum's competitors. Like you want to go ahead and build an Orbit L3 on Base, you can do that as well today. So Orbit is basically, it gives you the ability to launch your own chain, either as an L3 or as an L2, and I can talk about that. But the idea is that for some users, they want to customize more and they want to also have maybe more control of their economics and their fees, right? So, for example, over the weekend on Arbitrum Nova, there was this very large spike where one project was doing a lot of transactions. And what happens is that time, and Arbitrum Nova did over the last week or so, for a couple of days, more transactions than like any other L2, much more than Ethereum was like really doing a ton of work, but because primarily driven by this one project. And if you're on that chain, then your fees are going to go up together with that. So some games, for example, and actually one Arbitrum Nova game called Proof of Play, a very strong team whose founder Amit was one of the creators of Farmville. So a really strong team there on Arbitrum Nova. They're doing fantastically well. And they just announced yesterday, hey, we're actually moving over to our own Orbit chain because they want to now have control the environment, control the fees, and I think will be actually really good for them. But people use Orbit for different reasons. So you have projects that want their own fee control. They don't want to compete for fee space with others, but they still want to be secured ultimately by Ethereum. So that's why they'll build there. You have others that might just want to do it from a branding exercise. Hey, we just want our own chain. I think we'll be good. Others might want to give more utility to their token. So in Arbitrum 1 and Nova, the fee token of the chain, the gas token is ETH. But in Arbitrum Orbit, you're free to use ETH. You're free to customize that at will. Others might want to govern their chain. And then we're seeing some differentiated experiments as well. I'll just mention two or three of them. There's a chain called Kinto that they are a chain for institutionalized investors, and they are having a KYC on-chain environment, so a whole chain focused on the needs and the regulatory requirements that can cater to institutions. You have chains like Frame or Rari Chain by Rarible that went live last week that are focused on creators and sharing back revenue with creators. And Rari Chain, on some of the first drops, creators made more than 100 ETH. So, the model is being shown to work. You have chains like Phoenix that are building on, all these are building on Arbitrum Orbit. Phoenix is a team of, so it's Phoenix, FHENIX. FHE is a cryptographic term called fully homomorphic encryption. And it's a privacy technology. So they're baking privacy in at the chain layer and actually using the Arbitrum Orbit stack, going deep into it, mixing in fully homomorphic encryption. And the idea is that you can basically start with the Orbit base and customize it in ways that change the fee structure, the gas structure token, the core cryptography that runs the chain. You can really do whatever you want. So lots of chains are doing different things here. Some are building L2s, some are building L3s, and they're all united by using the Arbitrum stack as the basis for their chain.
And the amount of innovation that's possible now because of this customization, like you said, you can really build exactly what you need, both technically, but then also really experiment on the customer acquisition side with the economics. Right? That's a big breakthrough. And then you get the security of Ethereum underneath if you decide.
Yes, and each chain basically runs their own chain. They choose. Each chain has to be vetted individually, of course, because you can get the security of Ethereum, but you can also not. So you give the power to developers. They also need to make the right decisions. But yes, ultimately we're seeing a ton of really strong chains, and the innovation is just really incredible to see because they're taking the same code base and they're doing things. Again, some of them are just doing branding exercises, which is fine. They're like, hey, we just want our own unique area, which is ours, which we can call our own chain. Others are doing things that are super, super deep, either in the economics of the chain or in the core mechanism of the chain design. And all of it is exciting to see. And it's all, the fact that it's all enabled by this one product is really cool.
Yeah. One of the things you talked about recently was some of these Orbit chains, they can decide to talk to each other. What does that enable?
Yeah, so there's this idea that we're working on called chain clusters, which is the idea that you can have a few chains that sort of loosely align, or maybe actually more closely align, to operate in some sense as one chain and allow for shared back and forth between them. And in the Arbitrum model, we believe that these clusters should be opt-in. There's not one mega cluster. There's different clusters, and sometimes they could be the same chain developer. For example, you can be maybe you're a project that just has a ton of usage, so you've outgrown one chain, and now you want to have two or three chains, but you don't want to expose your users to this like awkward like bridging. So can you abstract that away and allow them to basically have a shared bridge and do nice things of send basically better interop? So the answer is yes, you can do that with chain clusters. You just have to tie these chains together in a certain way. That's why it's really ideal when you're the same developer just having multiple chains yourself. But sometimes you'll have different projects that want to do this for together. Hey, we're both gaming projects. Let's form a chain cluster and we'll join this gaming cluster. It'll be great for users. There you have to be a little careful because what you get is worst of all security in this model. What I mean by that is if I'm allowing my users to bridge instantly to your chain, you have two chains, chain A and chain B, and they can like bridge quickly before even the Ethereum settlement time. If there's like a hack on chain A, you can quickly throw the bag to chain B, and then you're at the risk of every chain in this cluster. And actually, this is one of the core differences we have. So one of our competitors, they have this, Optimism has this thing called the super chain. And it's basically a chain cluster where they're really pushing that everyone's on the same cluster. But they have the same problem of worst of all security. And what they do then is they require you to be governed by them. And if you want to make any customizations, you have to get their approval, which makes a lot of sense because if we're in the same cluster and you're doing something like wacky and I don't trust that code, that's going to be a big problem for me. But it also limits customization a lot because, and I actually have this, there was a project by Gitcoin called the Public Goods Network that said they wanted to do like this thing of sharing creator royalties, but they couldn't get like the approval to do that as part of this super chain. So that's why we believe strongly that customization is key. And so not forcing people to be governed by some other entity to be limited in what they can do. These chain cluster operations should be opt-in. And that's the way that we're building this technology by default. And the second thing on this interop is we're working closely with a team called Espresso on building decentralized and shared sequencing technologies. So it's a related point. The idea is these chains have sequencers, and sequencers can basically order transactions. And if you imagine that the same mechanism, the same decentralized mechanism, or the same, you could just think of it as the same entity is like choosing the transactions from different chains, you can get some better interop. Like I can tell you, like you send me two transactions and I say, okay, I'm only going to include this transaction on chain A if I also include this one on chain B. And now you can say it starts looking like a faster bridge because you can know it has some sort of atomicity. It gets a little complex because you can do things like inclusion, but like you don't really know what's going to happen on a chain. Maybe there's not enough gas balance in one chain, so there's one executes and one doesn't. So there's a lot of complexity involved, and Espresso is a very strong team that's together with our research team that's working on some of these problems. But there's also more paths to interoperability with the idea of can multiple chains share the sequencer or more generally share some of the same infrastructure in a way that binds them together more closely and gives you better opportunities for interoperability.
Makes sense. But there's that theme in the way that you approach these chain clusters. There's that theme of level playing field for everybody. Let the developer ultimately decide who they want their counterparties to be when it comes to taking on that risk as opposed to deciding it centrally.
That's right. And one of the key differences between Arbitrum, Orbit, and its structures and some of our competitors is no one else is governing you. The Arbitrum token, for example, shouldn't govern these Orbit chains. They'll choose their own governance. Hey, like maybe the one chain cluster won't want to work with them. So we don't try. That's fine. But you'll naturally form these relationships. And I personally think that you're going to have different verticals, like the NFT folks and the gaming folks and the DeFi folks and the real world assets / institutional folks don't necessarily all need to be in the same cluster, right? So you have these clusters around users, around applications that will be very helpful. And of course, you'll have ways, maybe slightly worse ways to bridge between clusters. You're not locked in. But I think if we can get verticals on one together, then you're going to do a lot to solve some of the interop problems. You don't need to have everyone on the same chain or everyone even on the same cluster. But if you can figure out where the lines are, hey, so where 90% of users going to be clustering themselves and make it super easy for them to spend their time in that cluster with great interop. And then, sure, when they want to jump to a different one, they'll have to go over a bridge. I think that's really just fine.
And do you think we're at the point now, it's so flexible, like what you've been able to build and what you've been able to empower developers with, where they can choose the underlying security mechanism, they can choose a data availability provider, they can choose to modify the economics. Are there other major dimensions of customization that are yet to be built, or do you think like the tools that developers have today are sufficient where, given the huge panoply of different kinds of applications to be built, most of the infrastructure that most of the developers will need in terms of customization is there?
It's a great question. So I'll say two things. One is I think there's definitely more to come. I think that we're just tapping into what a chain is and what a chain can do. And I think we'll have different notions of chains being useful for different purposes. And I think that we will see probably more tooling and more customization that comes over time, particularly as we find new applications and new use cases for this technology and having customizations that are targeted there. At the same time, maybe we'll seem slightly contradictory, but I don't think it actually is. I think at some point you get fatigue and like too many options, right? So if I'm a developer today, it's okay. So which roll-up stack do I use? I don't know. There's like 5 or so. And then, okay, which data availability stack do I use? Okay. And now do I want to like, which fee token do I use? Do I want to go ahead and join shared sequencing? Do I want to join a chain cluster? Do I want to work with one of the third-party bridges like Hop, Connect, Layer 0? And there's just so many decisions to make and so many different pieces of technology that are different but often overlap. And I think that I don't want to say too many choices because I think we're at the point of experimentation and that's how we'll get to the right thing. But I think ultimately what the market will really need at some point is a little bit of consolidation where it's clear to us. So a developer can come in and have a very good sense of at least the differences of the options that are available. I'm not saying there should only be one option available, like by no means, but a really good understanding of what's available and what the trade-offs are so they can make those decisions. I feel like today it's a lot of different teams experimenting in ways that are very much overlapping with similar claims, and it's probably hard for developers. And I'm guilty of this. We're guilty of this ourselves, right? So I'm not trying to say anything negative about anyone. I think that we think very technically, but ultimately, particularly as the market grows, and even the developers that come in will be less sophisticated about the particulars of this technology that we're building. They might know a lot about how to develop their game or their social network, but they'll maybe know less about blockchains. But blockchains can still offer them a lot. We're going to have to, I think, abstract a lot of the complexity away to a point where you can just know, okay, this is what I should build if I want to do this.
Makes sense. This happened in the Web 2 world, right? You had the LAMP stack, initially Linux and PHP, and then you had the ELK stack with Elastic and Kibana. And so I think you're right. Like it will happen. There'll be a whole bunch of different options within Web 3, and then people will consolidate on a handful of reference architectures for different kinds of trade-offs as a jumping off point. And then if you really need it, then you go and pick up the best of breed or DA layer or whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that there will be probably a few options that survive in each vertical. So I think that we have the strong teams today, even the up-and-coming teams today, I think will have a great future. I'm just saying, I don't think that this future is sustainable where there's just a proliferation and an exponential growth of options, because that's what's happening, right? If you have this vertical, each one has a couple of options, there's just going to be an exponential decision. It's just the exponential possibilities of what you can build. And I think that's going to be confusing for developers, but also confusing for users that want to, or even worse equipped to understand this. I think some consolidation is important, and some consolidation might also mean specialization and pivoting for some, where it's not that it will go away, but there are certain teams that might be offering like 5 different things today, and they'll specialize towards one, and they'll have some sort of understanding of how the different puzzle pieces fit together in the market.
Makes sense. And that ties into recently, last year, you released Stylus. And one of the things that's been pretty interesting coming from the Web 2 world, going into the Web 3 world, is there are a bunch of like Solidity, which is a language of Ethereum that the engineers use, is a bespoke language, a domain-specific language. And then you have other L1s bringing in Rust. Stylus is a way to open up the developer ecosystem to allow people who write in different languages to come into Web 3. How important is that as a barrier? I mean, maybe the 5,000 or 6,000 roughly software engineers within crypto, according to the Electric Capital survey. How important do you think it is to be able to accept other languages to come in to program Web3 applications?
I think it's really important for a few reasons. Number one is just if you focus on the people. There's estimated to be maybe a few tens of thousands, maybe less, Solidity developers in the world. There's estimated to be about 3 million Rust developers and about 12 million C and C+ developers, right? So if you just zoom out for a second and you realize, and for me particularly, my whole day is with these few tens of thousands Solidity developers, and it feels like the whole world. But if you zoom out and actually say, where are we trying to go? There are just so many more people that develop in these other languages, and I think that's going to become important to include them and to really bend our technology to them rather than asking them to bend to us. Mm-hmm. While I believe that, I don't think that's the most important argument, because I think a really strong developer or a company that's really interested in launching on the blockchain, like they'll be able to learn Solidity. It's annoying. I think that in the aggregate, we need to fix this, not fix it, but make affordances for others. I don't think Solidity should go anywhere. I think Solidity is here to stay, but I think if we can expand the pie and expand the tooling, it's good. But like a good developer will be able to learn Solidity. No one's gonna not, especially like a large Web2 company is not going to say, we want to go do all this on Ethereum, but oh no, like we just don't know how to write Solidity. That's not going to happen. But the second thing I think is important, which is part of the same thing, is not the humans, not the developers, but the code that they've written. You have years and years of legacy code written in these other languages. And now you say to these teams, imagine there's a gaming studio that has some gaming engine, and you say, it turns out that you have to write Solidity. It's not going to be that they can't learn Solidity. It's like, oh no, we have to like go ahead and take all that we've done and rebuild it.
Yeah.
And also like libraries, like think about like advanced cryptographic libraries or even machine learning AI libraries, right? So these don't exist in Solidity today for the most part. So you'd have to write them. But if you can actually just pull in these other languages, it's not about the people. It's just about, I can just pull in the cryptographic library used by SSL or whatever, or some other maybe more advanced cryptography library that's been battle tested. Wonderful, great. Like I can just pull that in on chain. So I think that's the second thing that's really important about Stylus, which is access to the legacy code. And Stylus is very different than what I've seen in any other blockchain, because in other blockchains, like you mentioned, you have the Rust chains, you have the Move chains, but these are all like isolated environments. So if you want to develop in Rust, then you can go to say Solana or Near. If you want to develop in Move, you can go to Aptos or Sui, right? So this is like and that exists today, and that's great. But there is no, with the exception of Arbitrum Stylus that I'm aware of, there is no environment that's a single environment that you can synchronously interact with other contracts, but in a way that's agnostic to the language they're written in. Actually, you can even have a single contract. Imagine that you're a developer today writing a DEX, and it turns out there's this one piece of your code that's expensive. You can rewrite that in Stylus, and everything still works. And that's in fact, in the Arbitrum Stylus, you don't know what a contract's written on chain. They all follow the same data format, so you can talk to them, and it doesn't actually, what language they're written in is completely abstracted away from you. This vision isn't new. Actually, if you go back into Ethereum history, there was a project called eWASM several years back, which had the support of a lot of the core Ethereum folks. For different reasons, it was early. WASM wasn't as developed yet. For different reasons, mostly technical, that project never actually came to see the light of day on Ethereum, but it had this same goal of what we call EVM plus, right? So the EVM isn't going anywhere. So if everything I said isn't interesting to you, you can still write your code in EVM. Everything that you've written on any Arbitrum chain is going to work perfectly well post Stylus. The fees aren't going to go up, but the fees will go down for Stylus contract. That's the third prong. So the first is the humans, the second is the legacy code, and the third is actually the fees. It turns out that Stylus is just a scaling solution, which makes sense because these other languages have years of compiler optimizations. They're just a lot more efficient. And so the amount of work that you can do, or computational work that you can do, is just much more. So we're estimating for computation about a 10x increase in capacity. For memory allocation, memory usage about 100x. Storage will be the same because that's the beauty. They use the same storage format, and storage is storage, but you're going to also get a lot of scaling out of it as well. So it'll enable cheaper smart contracts for those using it today, or another way is more bandwidth on the chain for those using it today, but also new applications that aren't possible today, and the code's not written today. And even if the code was written today, it probably couldn't be run on the current chains because it wouldn't be performant enough. It will solve two of those problems in one. You'll be able to take the code that exists, and because it's more performant, run it as well, and you'll be able to do advanced cryptography and the likes on chain with a low barrier to entry.
It's really impressive. And one of the questions and this has been a theme for us for a long time, is just the kind of the convergence between Web 2 and Web 3. You have this like Web 2 dedicated world, the Web 3 dedicated world. At some point, not all of them will converge, but there will be significant overlap. You talked about gaming studios bringing in some of their legacy code. How do you think about what needs to happen in order to marry those two worlds? Clearly, Stylus is a part of it, right? Because you have a lot of these languages. Are there other parts of the ecosystem that need to evolve so that you see a Salesforce with an Arbitrum database that's holding a bunch of data? Or is it more market awareness? Is there more technical limitation?
Yeah, so I think it's a few things. One is it's definitely some technical limitations. Although, again, I don't think that anyone today is not launching on chain because they can, but it's just another hurdle to go over. So in the world where this is like number 15 on your list, like if it's difficult, it just like never gets to it. If it's I care about that, I don't, but it's super easy to do, then it just becomes higher in your list. So I think that's important. It's not like a barrier to anyone who's like super convicted, but to those who are on the fence, I think making it easier, tools like Arbitrum Stylist that again bend to the developer rather than asking them to bend to the chains are going to be very important. I think though a lot of it is also market awareness, certainly, and we're seeing like really good trends here, particularly with like financial institutions. Franklin Templeton, for example, recently did a launch on Arbitrum. And that's like encouraging to see and encouraging to see them. And there's particularly in these industries, there's a lot of regulatory understanding that needs to happen as well. And I think that's also probably the third critical ingredient here, which is them really understanding what are the implications. And for each vertical, it's different, but studying that and say, what are the implications of putting this on chain? They're clearly take the financial and like the funds field. Yes, it's more efficient. It allows those efficiencies to be passed on to users, so it yields lower fees. Then there's a lot more that you can potentially do as well. But there's definitely a lot of figuring out what to do. So I would say it's both market awareness, but as well as a framework in which you, when you're aware of it, you can really evaluate it. And I think we as an industry are lagging a little bit there, and that's probably, in my estimation, holding some back.
Yeah. I mean, there's this amazing statistic, which is stablecoins processed basically the same amount of volume as Visa did last year. And I think we're going to hear more and more of these stories where technologies that are built on Arbitrum and others are really changing the world very rapidly. And you see it, like just like you said, Franklin Templeton and a lot of these financial institutions, PayPal launching a stablecoin, they're starting to be a lot of this dynamic.
Yeah, and there are so many like places, particularly payments, where just the speed and efficiency, and there are so many industries, archaic industries, where people just don't get paid for a while. Like you have these like, cross transfers. Like I was talking to someone yesterday, and they were telling me about this particular platform, like for booking hotels, and it's how long it takes for them to get their money. The guest is like gone by the time that like they're because of these like cross chain transfers. Sometimes it takes days to weeks for the final party to get their money. So there's so many places where the archaic financial system is slow and can be sped up. But some of the problems, they're real problems. There are reasons for that. But like when you have on-chain efficiency, but also the data structures that the blockchain that ensures the integrity, there's so much more that you can do so much more quickly. So I think for a lot of people, it will lead to just payments is like the most basic, but also probably the one of the most useful and places where you can actually immediately see the impact. We have these vendors that are just waiting for days or weeks to get paid. We have people that are paying exorbitant fees for cross-border transfers with 35 different middlemen. There's so much opportunity here to
Correspondent banks.
But there will also be obviously forces against that. There's 35 people that really don't want you to disrupt this industry. So I think it's going to be education, understanding the technology, understanding of make sure that you can comply in your particular field. There's a lot of very important work that has to be done before it can. But fortunately, there are a lot of really good people that are engaging and doing this work and getting to this clarity.
Awesome. All right, just to bring it home. So one of the theme I think of this conversation has been just like the community, how important it is, how important it's been from the beginning, how you design chains and developer outreach for those communities. Recently, you talked about an innovation that Web3 is bringing to open source. So you have closed source software where the code is hidden from the user. There's open source software. It's been a huge movement. And you introduced this idea of community source. And I'd love it if you just describe, what do you mean by that? And why is it such an important innovation?
Yeah, so this is something which, has been like brewing in my head for a while now. And I think there's something very important there. And in the Web2 community, or the typical software community, I should say, you have a notion of open source software and closed source software, and it's very well understood. And open source is one of the problems of open source, though, is often that there is not alignment. And that's why you sometimes have critical libraries that are like running the internet, and there are these critical bugs there. And you look and you say, wait, Google, Facebook, every single large company is using this, but who's contributing to it? And sometimes the answer is nobody. No one's really aligned around this project. It's just a sort of thing that's there. And it's just very hard for developers. And sometimes you have this where like open source developers just like they're enabling like billions of dollars for people of economics for people to use the code they've written, and they're really enabling the internet, e-commerce in many cases, and like they have trouble funding themselves. So I think that there's an interesting thing that Web3 can do here, because you have the notion of take Arbitrum, take all these projects. It's the notion of software with communities, a community that really feels that they have ownership of this software. And that's where I think that, and this is like in particularly in the roll-up space, but really in Web3 generally, there's a very big question about licensing, because the ethos of Web3 are open. From a security perspective, you certainly want the code to be visible, but like the ethos of Web3 are sharing and openness and community. But I don't think that's at odds with alignment with the community. So, for example, in the Arbitrum case, the code in Arbitrum, the Arbitrum Orbit program, the expansion pack program, is a great example of this. So, how is the program set up? If you're launching a layer 3 on top of the Arbitrum chains, it's free to do. You can do whatever you want, customize it at will, take the code, do what you want. If you're launching, and the reason is there's natural alignment with the Arbitrum community. If you're launching a chain that settles to Arbitrum 1 or Nova, pays fees to that chain, there's just natural, like that's the hub. When you want to come bridge the chain, you're going through the Arbitrum public chains, and it's just natural. But take the L2. You want to launch an L2 on Ethereum, you might just be competitive to Arbitrum, right? Because there's no natural alignment there, right? So any of Arbitrum's competitors can say, okay, it has the best technology, we can just use this now and compete with it. And that's where I think some of the alignment breaks down. But that's the nice thing, and the way Arbitrum Orbit program is set up is, if you want to do that's okay, but you have to contribute value back to the DAO. So the idea is that this fact that it's not fully open source by traditional means is not limiting anyone from using it. There's a path for them to use it as they will, but they just have to commit alignment to the project and contribute back to the project. And that's actually built into the license. Without Web3, without the community and the financial aspect of ownership of the community, you can't do this. It's like a really nice ideal. So you're stuck with everyone can use it or nobody can use it unless you talk to me. But now it's no, you don't need to talk to me. It's open. It's owned by the community, and you can use it at will. You just need to join that community and be part of that community and contribute back to that community. And I think it has a lot of potential to solve some of the biggest problems with open source development and make sure those projects are funded and aligned. And it's not one person developing it and spending all their time in it, and then someone else is taking their code and succeeding with it and contributing nothing back to them.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think at that point, like you look at Elastic and Amazon when they got into a tussle, or the MongoDB dynamics where people have to change their open source licenses in Web 2 to prevent an actor who just directly wants to compete in a way that doesn't contribute back to the project. You're right. Community sourcing is definitely an important innovation there. And because there's the token and people are owners of that token, everybody within the community benefits from a shared alignment.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Stephen, this has been amazing. I learned a ton today. The first thing I learned from you was developer equality was absolutely key to developing the vibrant community that you have built around Arbitrum. The second is that the customization of chains and the underlying components for different applications is going to continue. And we're seeing a lot of them, but there will be some consolidation on some reference architectures. And then the third is this idea that we just touched on, which is the evolution of open source licenses with community source is very likely the future of open software. So I'm really grateful for the time and for you sharing your learning. Thank you so much for joining us on Office Hours.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.